Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eleanor Chandler, and I'm the managing editor of Granta magazine, based in London. It's a quarterly print and online magazine that publishes fiction, reportage, memoir, and poetry and photography from around the world. It's a real pleasure for me to be chairing this panel on translation publishing. And it's even more exciting that we're talking to three independent publishers who are all prize-winning and innovative, and who have all really challenged the status quo in the time they've been active. I'd like to say welcome again to our audience. Thank you all so much for joining us. We've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to see in terms of questions if we might have time to open it up to a Q&A. But in the meantime, I do really encourage you to interact and leave comments in the chat box if you would like. So first, I would love to introduce Valerie Brandes, who is the founder and publisher of Jacaranda Books, which is committed to publishing diverse ideas and writers, covering everything from commercial and literary fiction to nonfiction, young adult and art books. Their authors include Venus Corrigata, translated by Anise Abbas Higgins, and Fiston Mwanza Majula, translated by Roland Glasser. Next, we have Naveen Kishore, who is the founder of Seagull Books, which for 40 years has published an incisive range of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, and has a long legacy of publishing in translation from writers such as George Louis Borges to Helen Sissou. And our third panelist at the moment is Deborah Smith. I believe she is not with us at this current time, but she is the founder of Tilted Access Press, which publishes Asian literatures in translation. Their authors include You Mary, translated by Morgan Giles, and Jayant Kakini, translated by Tejaswini Niranjana. She will join us later. Now, I know that translation plays a crucial role in all of your publishing practices. So I'd love for you each to talk about that role and why translation is a focus for your list. Naveen, I'd love you to start on this one.
Okay, 40 years of publishing next year. So I turned publisher overnight from theater lighting design, which I used to do. And in India, you tend to turn your hobbies into livelihood, and those are different circumstances. So overnight, the need to document a lot of the theater activity around me from different Indian languages. And you have to remember that there is no such thing as India. There are many Indias, there are many languages, there are many dialects, and all of you are familiar with this. English is the linked language. So when we started to publish, literally, the first thought was that we would need to translate, not because we expected people to jump around, doing Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, Malayalam, Tamil plays in English, because we were translating it, but because we expected them to be able to then read each other's language through this link, and then go back to their respective languages. And it took 30 years for that thing to play out, because 30 years later, suddenly a lot of these plays that people used to tell you, what are you doing this? This is so slow. How are you ever going to, it took 15 years to get out of the red. And I had no real plan except unveiling excitement one after the other. And it turned out that it took 30 years for it to start becoming text in universities. Now it's like, they sell thousands of copies because they've become text for people, low price things. So it's the translation seed was sown then, accidentally, if you like. And in 2005, and this is connected to perhaps later when we talk about our location and the politics of how locations and geographies matter, I did something tongue-in-cheek, which was that I said, what if we were Seagull London Limited? We've been told that this is a globalized world. And so therefore, if our money's as good as anybody else's, and we design good-looking books, if we can get reasonably courteous distribution, then perhaps we should be able to publish Valerie or Picasso, Eleanor, anybody, it should be possible in theory. That experiment is 500 books old. since 2005. And the only little twist was that we had a baggage. The baggage was that we would only buy world rights because all our years of independence, we were told, just buy for India, buy for India, buy for India, while we cherry pick from you. So that is what we did. Translation, because I grew up reading European literature, it used to be all available, right? The Americans were translating it, the English were translating it. And then, of course, the rules changed, the numbers game, accountants, everything changed, and the books disappeared. And I turned to Europe because I had knowledge of Gallimard and Zurkov archives by sheer default. And that's how it started. And it became suddenly, again by accident, a 70% translation and 30% of original English. And what I'm trying to say, and I'll end with that, is that it's essentially, there was no master plan, but retrospectively, when you look at it, it looks like a methodological sort of thing. And that's perhaps the personality of some of us who work together. It's a small team. But translators had a huge role to play in building this list. And in the appropriate place, we will speak about it. I'll shut up now.
Thank you. That's really fascinating, particularly the world rights. I think the situation is very, very interesting. Valerie, I'd love to hear from you on this.
So honestly, I feel like we're babies in comparison because we've been doing it far less long than Naveen. And I think our push towards building this translation list, which at the moment is very, very small. It's only 5 books, comes from more of a cultural question, perhaps, a multicultural question than a linguistic one. So, because here we are in the UK speaking English, so it's a different, vantage point. What our list has emanated from is our position as Jacaranda Books within the publishing world in the UK, a small Black-owned, ostensibly Black-led press. I mean, obviously, our remit is a bit broader than that, but we're proud of that we focus on the sort of diaspora, as it were. And so just sort of within that all-encompassing ethos of who we are as a company, our list grew. And so, when we're looking to build that list, it was literally an acquisition. We'll talk about it a bit more later, as Naveen said, but just as we would acquire any other book. So it had already been translated, but it was Fiston's Tram 83. And for me, it was the sort of delight of reading, this amazing novel set in, this amazing place and having that window open for us for another aspect of Blackness, as it were. So that's how it all started for us. And we really are keen to build the list because it does provide inroads, as Naveen said, into other ways of looking at the world. And I think whenever you also add race, which sadly just becomes, it comes with the territory for us, there's always another element, isn't there? There's always another layer of interrogation. So that's we're trying to build up. We have 5 books on the list at the moment, and 3 of them award winners, I might say. And we're trying to build the list, especially there's 90 million Afro-Brazilians, who have nobody reading their work or reading to them or hearing about them. No, not nobody, of course, there's lots of people, but there's definitely a part of the world that we're interested in exploring, as well as continuing to delve into Francophone Africa and parts of the Caribbean as well. So that's kind of how our list developed and why it's important to us.
It's so exciting. Yeah, I think you both have such similar sort of visions and on different timelines, but it's just really lovely to have you both together to talk about that. I guess the next question I'd love to ask is one to do with translators. How do you seek out translators and their work? And what are some of the things that you're looking for in a translation? Maybe Valerie.
Yeah, I'll go because I'm going to be much shorter. So again, I was introduced to translations by a book that was already translated. So I met the translator after the fact. And that was a process that I was at the tail end of. The second book we did was Venus Corrugata, 7 Stones. And that came to me from the translator. So I met Anissa Abbas-Higgins. She introduced herself. She said, I've got a lovely book that I would love to work on, and I think it'd be great for you guys. And so we sat down and we had this conversation and we worked through it. And I thought, great, it was a book that had been published, I think, earlier. So it was not a new book. And Venus Kurigata herself, I think, was already well up there in her years. But I thought the story, even though some people were saying it wasn't fresh, I thought it was just a beautiful, lyrical, lovely, sad, challenging place to inhabit for a while, and not a place that you normally see in literature. So all of those things drew me to it. And then Anissa brought another book to us, A Girl Called Eel. And then I realized that a lot of that lyricism and beauty was actually coming from the translator, so because she just has this beautiful air and just this eye for language that I really love. So, those two books came via her. And then the other three books in the list we acquired already translated from other publishers.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Naveen?
I came into it, as I said, when we decided to do the translation project for the world, as it were, it was 100 years of Jean-Paul Sartre. And I was familiar with having grown up on a book by a publisher called Brasilia in 1968, which had some 14 essays, and each one, the credit said Situations 14, Situations 40, which meant there must have been 14 huge volumes of Sartre. So I took a French photographer friend of mine, and who I was staying with in Paris, and walked into Gallimard and asked for a name I'd been given called Anne Solange. And Anne Solange, of course, was too busy, so she sent me to this wonderful person called Florence Guidi. And the next thing we know, we did 22 books on the trot, because she was initially hesitant. She said, why do you want Sartre volume, this? Even I don't know they exist, but I'll find out. But why for Calcutta or India? Then I explained the whole logistics. So I had to write for the estate, show my credentials, who was distributing, how it works. Once that first book, Aftermath of War, happened, it kind of opened floodgates. And it happened with a translator called Chris Turner, who came to me through a dear Verso editor. Again, I was asking around, remember, I'm sitting long distance. I'm sitting in a third world country, playing first world publisher. So it was kind of complicated. And Chris did a marvelous job. While I was doing this, I went to Zurkam. So I got myself an Adorno. I got myself Sila and Bachmann. Now, these names were people I grew up on, right? So there were no new young names here yet. So when the first circle came out of books, I then turned to the same translators. And I said, don't you have a wish list? And there was silence, because this is not what publishers are supposed to do, to go to translators and say, do you have a wish list? Anyway, to jump a little, basically it grew through this kind of serendipitous thing of asking translators, being very open, because they talk to each other, they talk to the writers. As Valerie said, ears close to the ground, they know who's doing what before the original publisher does. So I was beginning to be seen as some kind of a strange detective figure, because I was ringing up publishers like Hanser and saying, so-and-so is doing this. I said, but we haven't yet published it. We haven't got a manuscript. So, it was an interesting network. So the commissioning of the whole thing happened. Number one, other publishers started to send you their rights catalogs, 150 words of not so brilliantly written English prose on a certain book. But if something at that level first triggered an intuitive something, and with me, it had to be something of the human condition, I would then follow it up. I didn't even know. Remember, I was learning on the job. I didn't know how this thing worked. And so I would do things. I wouldn't, for example, ring you up and say, Eleanor, send me a sample translation. It didn't occur to me that you would A, have the resources to do that, and B, this is what people did. So I would still turn to my informal translators, who would either get excited or tell me we can't do it, or we're going to charge for this, or, this is terrific, why don't you do it? So that's how it was growing. And I was growing in confidence myself, being able to figure out some publishers are already sending you beautiful portfolios of sample chapters and so on and so forth. But it was always at the core a combination of intuition, translators, and very warm European publishers who figured out what you want and then went out of their way to protect you. For example, if I did 3 Paul Celans on the trot, the 4th one, the advance would come down from, say, 1,200 euros to 200 as a token sum. The publisher telling me that, it's okay, we're now seeing you as our principal. So there was support. It wasn't just, so it's no one thing. This process is all, it's a kind of, it can be a structured, more analytical, more formal way, but for somebody like me who's kind of very, I try and, it's my intuition, and I tend to follow my instinct and impulse and discussion, So out of the first 400 books, there were 3 we hated because there's a suspense to when they come translated, right? So you don't actually know. It's a lot like photography. If you're doing the old analog where you can't digitally edit everything quickly. You have to wait for the negative to process and develop. And similarly, the translations, when they came and you were in tears, you said, oh my God, we chose well. Or, Eleanor, the translator, or Valerie, the translator, chose well. So it's that sort of a thing. I don't have a method, but I don't know if that makes sense. Please.
Yeah, absolutely. I think intuition is such a huge part of what we do as publishers, and our relationships with translators are the key thing, as both of you recognize. And I guess next I'd quite like to talk about the editing process and what each of your experiences are like of editing translations, and how perhaps how the timelines are with the translation, because I imagine that's what some translators are interested in. Perhaps Valerie, you can, or Naveen.
Valerie, please.
Again, from my small amount of experience, which I think I've been a little bit spoiled, because when I have worked editorially, obviously it's only been with Anisa. And it also, as I said, it functions pretty much as our normal kind of editorial scheduling does. So we have in her case, both times we had a meeting to just talk about the book initially. She's like, I've read this book, I really love it, I'd love to work on it. Let me know what you think. And either we get a little sample translation, or she does me a few pages. And then in both cases, I like them. But I think it's such an interesting thing with translations. And maybe I have the luxury of this, Naveen. I don't know, because as I say, we've done so few. But maybe I'm falling in love with the translator more than I am in the translation. So I think in particular with A Girl Called Eel, that was a really interesting process, because it was a particular kind of book, had this sort of conceit of being a single sentence for the entire novel, but also it had been written in very non-traditional French. So by the time it comes to me, then what we're working through and what Anisa comes up with is an idea to access not the language in this case, but the character. So then we were trying to find a way to make this character, whose analogue in the UK is essentially, sort of the sort of Englishman on the beach with a knotted handkerchief and the socks and the sandals. Like, how do we make this character so that he can speak to the words in this book, but not override, the culture of the author and all of that stuff, So it was just such a dance, is how I describe it, the process. And of course, in the hands of somebody as gifted as Anisa, it worked out. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And I know that we had to sort of push the boundaries in some ways editorially for it to be able to work, because like I say, we were dealing with non-traditional French and we're dealing with a single sentence and all these things on top of one another. But I think overall, I think she did an amazing job. I brought a lot of the questions to the table, and then we were able to kind of grapple with them and come out with what I was aware was, somewhat removed from Ali Zamir's original text in terms of who, the Father All-Knowing should be. But at the same time, I felt okay with where we had, or more than okay, I felt happy with where we had ended up in terms of our characterization of this character. So, I mean, I don't know if that helps, but that was kind of that's the nitty gritty of that process, because it's, it's one of the 5 that we did.
I think it's really fascinating and sort of brings us to this idea of the paradox of translation, of, knowing that we can't be you can't replicate the original text, but doing what you can and creating this new text that conveys the spirit and some more, Naveen, would you like to talk about editing?
Yeah, well, very quickly, editing. And if there's time, I'll give you one little sampler of how things go wrong before they go right.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
so so when we started Seagull, remember we were just doing theatre scripts from different languages, but because in many ways they were our languages, and at that point, because we didn't know better, there were no precedents. So what we used to do was, so if person A is translating live author B, and the translated manuscript comes to you from this person and the playwright having seen it, we would hire somebody of equal stature, pay the person, because those languages people were available, right? Mm. And then you would have this three-way counter-checking going on before we even did the in-house edit to get as near perfect as you could. All of this went by was thrown out of the window when you're dealing with Chinese and, French and German and Italian. So you depended a lot on the translator, right? And of course, you did lots of in-house where you had a doubt, and I have many examples of the doubts coming, and most of them were justified. Then you did that expensive process of reaching out to, but it always had to be, because it was pricklier within the rest of the world than it used to be in India, because it almost felt as if you were, offending, you were at risk of offending. So there had to be that in line. One quick example of, so translator A comes with great excitement into the Frankfurt Book Fair and says, you just have to get this book. She hasn't hit 30 yet, but she's written stuff that it's like slitting your wrists and you just have half an hour and you write a book. And I said, who is the publisher? And she says, so-and-so, German publisher. I said, oh, here's my appointment sheet, they're the next one. The person comes and I say, oh, I want this. And she says, oh, you've spoiled my whole day because I was going to make a pitch for precisely this book. So that's how you bought that book. Gets translated, wonderful, author, translator, love each other. The author is very articulate in English. They travel to India, we do events, all that. 6 years later, she writes book 2. So who should translate it but translator A? Wonderful. Manuscript comes to you, goes to the author sends you an embarrassed, awkward letter saying, this is not working for me at all. What do we do? Now, this is a senior translator, and one that I swear by totally. And then, so I tell the author that, look, you should, of course, talk to each other. I can at best help regardless of costs. Eventually, the decision would lie with your convincing argument, whatever that is. And what is that argument? And she said that, look, she gave me examples. For example, it's the old one, which is 40-line sentence being punctuated because I, as translator, decide to ease things for English language readers. Not badly, not negatively, but because that's my natural instinct to do it in that rhythm. And it reads perfectly well, but it's not the author's intent. The translator understood this, but said, I can't take this on in that case. I'm really sorry. I don't wish to be paid. I said, no, but you have been paid and you've done your work. So that's okay. Happens. It's not like it happens in every book. Then started the detective work for finding a translator. Now, remember, I have one translated thing. Then I get a sample for second. She doesn't like it. Third, she doesn't like it. And I'm paying along the way. She finds a fourth person who sends a sample and my hair stands on edge because it's so different from all three. And the book gets done and gets come out. And strictly between us and the faceless audience, when the author wrote the third book, she's out looking for a large American publisher. That's life.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of how tricky and specifically kind of negotiative translations can be.
But you have to be hospitable to the author, and you have to do the best you can because we're all human and fallible. So
absolutely, it's about making your needs known and finding other people who can meet them. Okay. Thank you both very much. I'd like to move on to a publicity and marketing sort of angle, and sort of when translation books are printed, when everything's done, how do you find the experience of marketing and publicizing your titles in translation? And how does the translator play a role in this? Perhaps Valerie, you could start with this one.
Yeah, so it is a very complicated business, isn't it? And our experiences have been varied, I think. So the first book that we published was Tram 83. We had a very hard time getting the author, Fiston, to this country. And we did have a full publicity plan for that book. And so the challenge that we had was, do we have the translator or do we just not do anything at all? Because then there's another kind of translation happening, isn't it? In translation of the author's body, essentially. And for me, it just felt jarring. I'm going to be honest, to have this sort of African author and then have the white translator be, translating him in life as well as on the page. So I struggled with that. And so that wasn't, great, to be honest. And then, the other books that we published, obviously, some of the authors are just not available because we're also doing sort of this classic literature. So then we have to think about the vehicle of the translation list at Jacaranda and trying to sort of sell into the market kind of under this umbrella, of translated books by this publishing house, and they know what they're going to get when they come to us. And that's been a lot more successful. But again, it's that there is, because ordinarily when you do a book, you have the author, don't you? So there is this kind of weird space, essentially, that we do grapple with. To be honest, and the kind of expenses are involved as well for a small press. If we were able to be fortunate enough to get the author and to fly them over and put them up, it's just not feasible for us. So we just have to be a lot more creative in terms of getting books out there. The thing that's really awesome about this country is that there is this appetite for translated fiction as an umbrella term. And so once you start to talk about books in that way, then, the bookshops get behind you and, wholesalers get behind you. And then it's a much more kind of like feasible proposition. I think that, that's really, again, because the list is so small, the sort of stories.
Yeah. I was thinking, Naveen, you must encounter that problem a lot because a lot of your authors are no longer alive to do the publicity. So maybe that's
But they do occasionally turn 100. Yeah. No, it is a problem in the sense it's, for us, it's also, it is, as Valerie says, it's always for every single publisher, despite the odd booker and despite your odd, Nobels or whatever the hell you get, the money that is involved. So typically I think the focus for promoting translated literature, when your question where you said the role of the translator, yes, there is a role of the translator if she or he wants it. A lot of them do. A lot of the older ones don't wish to do it. Some do. The younger ones are more active. They're doing things. They're doing events, especially those based in Berlin or France. So. But the resources have had to come either from usual suspects, which, the cultural bodies of the French or the Germans and so on and so forth. So sometimes there have been known authors, sometimes not so known authors, and something has clicked, right? And some of those clicks have also led to relationships, which led to this business of, playing around with location and the politics of it. But our promotion in-house for every single book really focuses well before the pandemic on generating online interest, a certain kind of social media, the usual mailers, reaching out to people. I also tend to be very generous about allowing other, it's like, say, Valerie, and this is a offer and you are welcome to take it at face value. It's like, she has a book by Anissa that she launches in the middle of the pandemic and there is no audience. So I would say, I've got 32,000 names on my list. Do an emailer, I'll mail it for you. It's okay. Because it's also about sharing. It is a community. Nobody is making millions or intends to, or whatever. So it's good to be able to reach out and so on and so forth. So often we are doing this. We're actually being able to help work with others and smaller publishers and bigger publishers. The translator is very clued into that community often, and therefore has access to the authors. We've noticed that a lot for our Arab list and been able to do events, right, in England and America and so on and so forth. Of course, the irony is that the event quantum has leapt up because of the pandemic, because everyone's accessible on Zoom, and so we started to suddenly do these strange bookstore events, but there is no bookstore, so you would have an author at City Lights and McNally's or, Seattle and that kind of thing. So, but we don't know where it's going to go, all of this. It's still unfolding. I don't think the three-storied Waterstones or a Foyles is going to have, at a time, even 50 people. It's a tricky one. We may go there as a first surge, excuse the word, but there's almost as if something has changed. I'm no longer confident of being able to replicate what used to happen to revenues through physical book selling. So there's a lot of that. So it's become difficult. A lot of what we publish is so esoteric. And I confounded it all apparently I did some smart-ass wisecrack in some interview where I said, I wait for the market to come to me. So it's taken like 40 years to sell a book, but we still have books. And I'm serious, we still have books from 1983, which I then reinvent and say, and reinvention, by the way, just one last word, is very important. We've reinvented our German hardbacks into a whole library of German literature, designed it, and it also finds you a source of funding. So reinvention is interesting, especially when you instinctively don't publish single books. You publish authors. You have 11 by Valerie, 12 by Eleanor, because you stick with them, And then suddenly you have a set of 12 Sarts, for example. You reinvent your 3 volumes into 12 paperbacks. Go to the French, they give you 2,000 euros each. So, what I'm saying is it's all linked. The whole thing is a kind of process. There's no it's not segregated. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Valerie, interrupt me.
No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, it's exactly that. I mean, you're sort of describing our entire publishing, to be honest. If only we could be around for 40 years. I just wanted to add, that one of the things that we've benefited also from in the country is being able to submit for prizes, because those things have also been great marketing tools and drawn a lot of attention to the books, getting, especially the Society of Author Awards, a couple of them have got awards from the Society of Authors, and also the long listing for Fiston's book. So that helped, get them out. But Naveen's absolutely right. It's a hard slog.
One day we'll do a session on for 2 hours on awards and prizes and how that plays out. Who is allowed to submit what, when, where?
I know.
All this. I mean, I could give you documented evidences of exclusion that will frighten you. Even you know what that means. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I think those are really good points, and I look forward to that session. I think we've actually touched on quite a lot of the concerns that I wanted to raise around funding. We talked a bit about external funding. So I'd like to move on to this idea that the Anglophone publishing industry is, well, I mean, it's not an idea, it's true, and it's valid, often criticized for being metropolis-centric, London, New York, so limited to those 2 centers of power. And I'd really love to hear how each of your publishing really challenges that. Perhaps Valerie, you could start.
So the issue of London centricity for us, so going back to sort of the last wave of immigration to the UK, in the 50s and 60s, the majority of those Black people came to London. So you have a huge community of, poor people in a very wealthy city. So it's always a little bit chafing for me, this idea of like, oh, the big glitzy city where everything happens, when the reality is there's an awful lot of people in London that don't have anything, don't have means, don't have access, talk about being excluded, as Naveen was saying. And so we are London publisher, very proud to be so, but not in the way that people use the language about London. And I think it's really important to say that we are trying to occupy this space where we're not, we're often disregarded, you know, because when people talk about London, they think in Canary Wharf and Glass and Steel and Money Mile and all that nonsense, you know, and we know the deprivation, but we also know the sort of traditions, the richness, the kind of vibrancy, the real kind of intellectual interrogation and interest and fascination with books and language and culture. You know, there's a statistic that shows that Black people are the #1 users of libraries in London. And I don't know if that's a class issue or not, but we go to the library more than anyone else. We do read there. We do have a market. We buy books. We love, you know, so that's where we sit in terms of like trying to address this London-centric notion and this sort of Anglophone notion, because also we are attacking that just by our very existence as well, you know, and I think we have to really face it head on that we're only here because of colonialism. We're only here because of slavery. So, but we are here. And so you can't have it both ways, you know, you can't have it that, do you understand what I'm saying? So yeah, and I'll leave it at that. So we're here.
No, I think that's a really fascinating answer to that question. Naveen, would you like to?
Yeah, gosh, it's a huge topic, but
yeah,
briefly, there's a book we published by Mark Auger called No Fixed Abode. Not homeless, no fixed abode. And, you know, I've often thought of that, but people are so confused about our location. So you, of course, started life in Calcutta. You still design and produce in Calcutta, but you print everywhere, London, New Zealand, Australia. You know, you print where you need to print, America. Okay. I'm going to treat this as a kind of questioning of the status quo, which is London to New York, which for me represents a certain kind of English-speaking West. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we're a Seagull Books London Limited. So I'm a London publisher, which is independent. It's not a branch of Seagull Books Private Limited. So the legality is there. The politics of it is that we chose not to have an architectural reality in the form of an office or staffing. You saved that to invest into the thing because you said you have that structure elsewhere and we can zip anywhere and produce anything. So the rules of the game changed at that level. Now, it's taken us 15 years to get to a place where now we feel the urge that we miss a person on the spot for various reasons, just to organize an event, for example, because you're constantly hiring people in short-term interns and so on and so forth to kind of do that. But what is interesting is that what has been established is that we, as I said, we take world rights and we explain that to people, that we are distributed into the world by University of Chicago Press, who are not penguin random. So they don't do that sort of numbers, but there is a kind of courteous visibility and sales that you can, you know, sort of. Yeah. But to me, what the real interesting thing is that a lot of authors, particularly from the Arab list, Iraqis, Palestinians, Iranians, were not represented, even within the charm circle of a literary agency-fed community, are suddenly allowing us, because of our so-called experience at Frankfurt, to negotiate language rights. So you're suddenly doing what old-fashioned publishers did before agents came on. The rights person handled and looked after reinventing into different languages and so on and so forth. And one brief example that I'll end of really questioning it, which is some years ago, an author of ours, a Cameroonian writer, writing in French, Leonard Amiano, came to visit us as a star figure representing the French who had invited her to the Jaipur Festival and then to the Seagull Publishing School to do a masterclass. Her book, Season of the Shadows, was launched, all of that. Next year, she came back at her own cost as a student at the Seagull School of Publishing because she wanted to do something in Africa. And so she wanted to learn. And this is when she came here, we discovered that she had been let down by a major French publisher who had promised her, what Valerie was talking about, a certain kind of non-fiction political essay series, an imprint in her name, which was about Francophone Africa, certain kind of political writing, because she was connected. This was where she inhabited the spaces, grew up, talked, all of that. So I said, so this is right for us. Why don't we do it? She said, oh, in English? I said, no, we'll sell the French the right to the original French that you're writing in. The first 2 books are out, wow. Shades of Black and Blind Spot, one by an Ethiopian academic based in America. Shades of Black, I had no idea that there were hierarchies akin to what we face in India all the time. Yeah. For somebody who's half French, half Cameroonian. So yeah, there's all kinds of things happening, and these books have been received very well. And we have started to sell the rights to the French, and the Germans, and the Italians. So that is what engages us, this business of upsetting the status quo, not in some cavalier crusading manner, but because you enjoy publishing a certain literary life, and this is part of it.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly see and agree with that. I feel that sometimes we sort of joke here, we kind of live in a little Jacaranda bubble, and we do. Like some of the first books that we acquired, one was with a Cameroonian publisher, another one was in Nigeria, and that was the idea of like being able to position ourselves here in London and just reach out across the globe to all of the wonderful, sort of areas that were kind of being neglected. But yeah, you do kind of feel like we're just in this little bubble that's not quite the publishing world. We're sort of adjacent to it. Like we're doing everything traditionally, but in our own happy way.
Yeah, but what is interesting, and I'm sorry, but I sound like a sort of out of work priest, and sort of with evangelical fervor. I've been pushing this for the last year and a half. That during, because of the pandemic, there is so much that all of us can do together, which we are not able to. Some of us are, but sort of reaching out beyond traditional structures, whether they're financial structure. It's just basically that old-fashioned, boring thing of being able to share what little you have in a certain kind of way. The resource, experience, money, whatever. And that is what is something that when the pandemic has certainly taught us to do personally. But sorry, I'm
not at all. It was really great. Thank you both. I think we might have some time for a couple of questions. There are some already in the Q&A, but if anyone wants to add some, we might be able to get there. The first question I'd like to ask you both from Ruth is with regard to sales materials such as synopses, blurbs, sample translations that you tend to receive from literary agencies or foreign rights people. How adequate are those materials in helping you make an acquisition, and how could they be improved if they could be? Maybe Naveen, do you have a perspective on this one?
With regard to the sales materials and sample translation, okay. I think they're reasonably accurate in the sense that I think there are translation issues there too. They're getting better. When 2005 I started, I used to find it that they could be put together in slightly better translated blurbs and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the rest of the European world now takes on English-speaking interns and so on and so forth. So the material, that initial communication of the rights catalog is usually wonderful, because you're doing those half-an-hour meetings at Frankfurt, so on and so forth, or 3 times or 4 times or twice a year, you're getting these seasonal rights catalogs, which give you this material, so to speak. When you get to the next steps, depending on the author, whether it's a first-time author or whether it's a established author, you get these press kits with, and now there are agencies, as you know, the New Books in German and so on and so forth, and the French, and who's sending a lot of material from those quasi-government cultural organizations that feed you with sample translations and so on and so forth, often publishers do, even without requesting, they come with that. You get lots of reviews. Earlier, it used to come in German or French, and I couldn't read them, but now they get translated and they send you that. So I think there's no one rule as such, but this is the pattern that what we have accidentally done, which is very interesting, is because now there's over 140 German books, for example, we find that our translated, edited PDFs become great sources for the original publisher to reach out. Remember, I was talking of Indian languages, like to reach out to all kinds of people who don't read German. And so inadvertently, it's become like a service because so much exists like a corpus over these 15 years of French and German books that I've done. So they use those PDFs. A lot of this has also led to films being made and so on and so forth, because somebody in a certain film community could read English. And so it's an interesting, you have all sorts of job opportunities here to think about, and internship opportunities in countries where using the languages that you have on offer, there's always somewhere somebody, not just the English guys, who will have needs for it and so on and so forth. So,
Valerie, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, no. So I agree. We get those two submissions from agents, but I think we're quite intentional at the moment because we're so small in actually trying to build relationships with translators because it's worked for us. So we're commissioned maybe one book a year at this moment. So if we can find a translator that wants to work with us and sends us a book that they love, if they've read it and loved it, that's half the battle won as far as I'm concerned. So then we have a conversation about how we make that a reality. So we're able to go quite slow at the moment and be quite intentional in doing so and focus more on these relationships at this level rather than lots of submissions coming from all over the place. So, yeah.
Great. So the next question, which I will highlight, I think, so you can all see it, is from Jackie. In the post-editing phase, what role would translators play here? We sort of touched on this a little bit, but I think maybe there's opportunity for more. Are they still involved after they've handed in their work? Would you inform the translators of your modifications? And if there are disagreements, how do you deal with them? Maybe Naveen, would you like to?
Yeah, they're involved throughout in the sense that, it depends on the work. So when it's a work of literary fiction or poetry, it's smoother and easier, if it reads well in a different sort of language. We don't disappear. Translators get to see proofs. They get to see the word proofs on the whatever edits. They're not heavy edits unless there's something terribly wrong with it. So the translator gets to see that. Then they get to see the page proofs. And along the line, they do their second, third thinking, some of them, who are the kind who don't want to let go necessarily till they fine hone it because their name's going on it. So, yes, they definitely, and we listen because they are the voice of the author, right? In the absence of the author being able to communicate that sort of thing. So there's absolute familial closeness here. There's no, and if disagreements, you deal with disagreements. I deal with disagreements personally by giving in, unless it's because if somebody is talking sense, it makes sense. When they're not, then one has to find a kind of thing through conversation, which one does. I don't have any unpleasant memories. There have been disagreements. There have been sometimes sulks on both sides for about 30 seconds. But other than that, it is a together thing. The book is not done in isolation. I know there are publishing traditions where once you've given that in, that's it. Even people used to behave as if we had discovered putting people's names on covers. Ridiculous. It was an instinctive thing. I came into publishing overnight. I didn't know the conventions. I just assumed somebody who's given voice to somebody else has to be put there. And so then suddenly it turned out to be like a great political act. No. And it's the done thing. But there are also people who don't. There's a whole tradition of a certain kind of university press which doesn't put it. The same translator may be unhappy with a certain independent for not putting their name on the thing, but they happily go along with that too, because circumstances, you can't judge. It's all, everything is, if it's, you have to not get into an us and them situation, because it isn't. Sometimes somebody thinks it is a formal once the contract is signed, or when things go wrong, you start doing debit credit. The idea is to not allow the debit credit. It's not a bad marriage. You have to remember the good days, So I think there's no reason, I'm sorry, there's no single answer. Everything is so unique. I can give you can talk to me, you could get my email, I could give you anecdotes. It's not a problem.
Exactly. What Naveen said.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question from Katie. I'll just highlight it for you both. When you were approached by translators, what works best? An introduction from a friend or colleague, a hallway elevator pitch, verbally and in person, submitting online? How can translators best get your valuable time and attention for a new work?
All of the above. I mean, I've had all of the above. Not the elevator, but a cafe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's how you convey the excitement. And if you're not conveying the excitement, there is a courteous way of saying no. That's the other thing, which I feel that whenever you get something that appears to be not working for you, like an unsolicited something, you have 30 seconds to say no or yes, because somebody is depending on this, because every second that you don't say, you build expectation.
Yeah.
So it's very important not to sit on your high horse or be nervous or awkward. It's like talking money with friends, because translators have all become family. And sometimes when I can't pay them $20,000 for a particular tome of 1,200 pages, I say, look, I could pay you maybe 12 and then give you some more royalty from day one. Or, you improvise things.
Yeah, exactly.
But you must talk money. You must talk everything that you're awkward about, put it on the table between the two of you, and then you can size it. It's there.
Yeah, the same. And because we are actively, looking. So for us at Jacaranda, what I think would be important is for somebody, whoever wants to work with us, to make sure that what they bring in is something that we're going to publish. So that would be the only thing. And you'd be surprised how many people will bring something that's just not even relevant to anything that we do. So that, just pay attention to what we publish, but then, send us an email. And as Naveen said, be realistic, be honest, be open about what you want and where you're at in your practice. I think that's what helped with Anissa. Anissa, I think we were the first publisher that she actually had a book published with. And so it was a very new process for both of us, but it worked out beautifully because we had this ongoing communication all the time, and there was no sort of hidden expectations. And also, more significantly, she understood, because we are a very, very, very small press at the end of the day. We sound like the mighty Jacaranda, but we're tiny. And I think that Anissa was very much aware of that and very much forgiving of that process, because, you can't always just turn everything on a dime, and she was quite flexible in that way. And that's why I was happy to work with her a second time when it was a bigger project and more money involved, and we'll be happy to work with her again and again and again.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both. I wondered if you both had any other tips for translators, or whether there were any particular challenges that you thought you'd experienced working with translators that could be avoided somehow, or any other wise tips that you would like to impart before we wrap up.
Valerie.
Wise. I don't have many wise tips. I will say one experience I had, and obviously I was quite new to the process, so I didn't really understand how to deal with it myself as a publisher, was that we had, it was the book that we ended up publishing, but I asked two or three other translators to do an extract. And then I didn't like any of them. And then one of them got really upset because we weren't paying them. And then I didn't know, should we pay for the extract? I didn't actually know what to do. So I learned in the long run, I think you do have to pay for extracts. So I haven't done it since, but I learned the hard way. So just bear in mind, when you're reaching out to publishers, to pay attention to educating them as well. It's not just a one-way street. Like, don't assume the publisher knows everything about what you want and how you work and what works for you. You know, just as Naveen was saying, be very open and upfront about the sort of details of the process. So I would say just that.
Yeah, I would agree from my experience as well. I think it's
totally.
Just have a frank conversation about what everyone expects. And Naveen, sorry, do continue, Naveen.
Yeah, no, just that. It's trust. It's absolutely and totally and completely about trust. And the thing about trust is that sometimes you have to perform it before it becomes second nature, right? So you may begin in a certain way, a certain note, or you may be suspicious sometimes because of, any number of reasons, because of your own experience. You may have had 3 bad experiences on the trot and then you expect it again. So there has to be a relationship of trust around the fact that the translator, in most cases, is wanting to do that work, as is the publisher. Often I have done books which I have not even read or looked at, or when I say read, even a sample, because I'm working with the translator that I said, I actually say silly things like this in my head, that she's paid her dues. She really wants to do this. I'm just the conduit. I acquire the rights. I've done this often and been delighted with it later, when it's come, all the rest of it. Because it's really a small price to pay for the sheer joy of what we do. Of course, the stresses are there and all of that. And, we have to make the numbers work and be practical, impractical, whatever. But at the core of it, it has to be trust in what you're doing, the people you're working with, every bit of it, and being open to the fact that it's not all going to be hunky-dory and agreeable and warm and affectionate, but you will perform ways of making it happen, even by, sort of sitting on your own annoyances often. And it works both ways. The translators and publishers, there are no hierarchies here. I may be paying for the book to get done, but where would I be without you?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. I think that's all we have time for today.
That's a lot. Take a break, Eleanor.
Agreed.
Really fascinating talking to you both. Thank you both for your generous engagement and answers.
Thank you.
The audience are really brimming with just stimulation. And I want to also thank the audience. Thank you for being such attentive listeners and also for your incisive, thoughtful questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Take care, everyone. And I hope you've enjoyed this amazing week of translation. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.